Well into the September 10th debate between Kamala Harris and the now President-elect Donald Trump, ABC News anchor David Muir posed a question to the then Republican nominee Donald Trump. Do you want Ukraine to win this war? Trump refused to answer directly. I want the war to stop. When David Muir repeated the question, Trump again evaded. I think it is in the US's best interest to get this war finished and just get it done. This confirmed Donald Trump's long-standing goal to end the Ukraine war, and when considered along the current state of hostilities in East Ukraine, Trump's re-election casts a gloomy shadow for the Zelensky regime.
We have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin, and I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it resolved.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have a lot.
This is especially so as President Putin has made his terms for any negotiations crystal clear, which will require as a precondition actions that are tantamount to a surrender of the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, Ukrainian President Zelensky was quick to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory, as reported in the Newsweek newspaper. The sentiments in response to Trump's re-election amongst Ukraine's population is, however, mixed. Yahoo News reported that Natalia Pikachi, who fled the southern city of Mariupol when it was under siege by the Russian armed forces in 2022, said that she expects that crucial aid would dry up. It's worrying and disturbing, she said in an interview. Something will change. There will not be the same kind of support as before. Some Ukrainian officials remain optimistic and have adopted a wait-and-see approach. Tatiana Podelska told Yahoo News of her speculation that future US support for Ukraine did not hinge entirely on who was the president. In quotations, I think his role is a bit exaggerated, that he will drastically change something for the worse. She nevertheless conceded that things certainly would not change for the better. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, the press secretary of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov, said that he was unaware of President Putin's plans to congratulate Trump on his victory. At a press briefing, he said these words of caution: "Let us not forget that we are talking about an unfriendly country that is directly and indirectly in the war against our state." When speaking about the topic of Trump's repeated promise to stop the war in Ukraine as soon as possible upon his re-election, Peskov noted that although the United States is able to contribute to the end of the conflict in Ukraine, it cannot be done overnight. A bit of skepticism also emerged from his following response. The true intentions of the new US administration can be judged after the inauguration, and he then finished with this warning. Upon entering Oval Office, sometimes statements take a different tone. The prominent Ukrainian military expert, Sergei Gurets, weighed in on the US election results. He noted that several packages of US military aid have already been announced, which ensures some stability and continued supply of weapons to Ukraine. However, he noted that the main challenges for Ukraine will arise in the coming months. After all, he said, regardless of who wins the US election, there will be a period of uncertainty until the inauguration on the 20th of January next year, and that during this time, he said, in quotations, Ukraine can hardly expect important initiatives from the American side. Most notable, I think, was his comment that this period provides a window of opportunity for our enemy to exert pressure on the front line, realizing that no powerful initiatives will be implemented by the United States at this stage. This, he said, creates additional threats for Ukraine in the course of combat operations against Russia. And Mr. Gurets's fears are certainly warranted, given the current situation on the front line of East Ukraine. Early this morning of the 6th of November, before the election results were announced, Mr. Gurets, in an interview with Ukrainian TV, admitted that Russia is focused on capturing Kurakhove by encircling it from the north and south while attacking from the east. They have 60,000 troops in this section of the front, he said. The most critical area to the south of Kurakhove extends from Yasna Poliana to Constantinople, particularly along the road connecting Kurakhove to Zaporizhia. If Russian forces manage to reach this road, Ukrainian logistics in the area will be severely affected. Additionally, Mr. Guretz commented on the Russian pressure from Bohoyablenka through Trudove toward Ospenivka. This assault on Ospenivka, he said, poses a threat to 3 Ukrainian brigades: the 79th Airborne Brigade, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, and the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. So it is in these areas of the front, that is, Kurakhove and Pokrovsk sectors, where I will focus today's online report. I will also speak about a third overlooked factor that can prove more destructive for Ukraine than the Russian army or President Trump's re-election. And this final factor is fast approaching for Ukraine, so make sure to stick around toward the end of the video to hear my report. And always remember, hit the like button, subscribe button, notification bell, and please consider making a donation via Super Chat or Super Thanks to support my research. And let's get into it. In October, Russian forces managed to occupy 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, making their largest territorial gains in both 2023 and 2024. They captured 321 square kilometers in the Kurakhove direction, 53.5 square kilometers in the Kupiansk direction, and 46.5 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk direction. However, these 3 fortress cities still remained under Ukrainian control, making them priority targets for the Russian forces, likely by year's end, or perhaps, as Mr. Guretz worries, just in time for the US inauguration of President Trump on the 20th of January next year. To expedite the capture of Kurakhove, Russian troops are reportedly redeployed from Pokrovsk to this area. Securing Kurakhove would create opportunities for a rapid westward advance, potentially reaching the border of Donetsk and allowing Russian forces to bypass Pokrovsk from the south and the west. The battle for the Kurakhove city itself has already begun, the Russian tanks breaking through to the city's eastern outskirts. Russian forces are now attacking Kurakhove from 3 directions, concentrating significant resources and making incremental progress each day. They appear to be accelerating their efforts, as capturing the city would have strategic implications for developments on other parts of the front. On the northern front of the Kurakhove direction, Ukrainian forces are conducting what they would like to call strategic rearguard actions, gradually retreating to maintain defensive positions. In reality, however, the effect of these actions is that over the past week, Ukrainian troops were forced to withdraw from several villages, including notable defense villages of Izmailivka, Kurakhove, and Alexandropol. While they managed to avoid encirclements thus far in these areas, the Ukrainians face ongoing pressure from Russian forces advancing westward. Russian troops are currently pushing through Ukrainian defenses in Novoselidivka and have taken control of more than half of Novodimitrivka and are progressing toward Sonsivka. The Russian long-term objective appears to be reaching the Kurakhove reservoir's shore to potentially attack the city from the rear, thereby threatening Ukrainian defensive lines. In the ongoing assault on Kurakhove, Russian forces are not only launching a direct offensive from the east, but are also attempting to expand their control southward toward a series of villages along the Suki-Yali River. Ukrainian media claims that this area ought to have a robust Ukrainian defensive line intact, positioned to repel advancing Russian units from the north and the south. However, as I previously reported, the allegations of corruption and inadequately built defenses in Southern Donetsk make this claim less plausible. Nevertheless, the Russian strategy in this sector appears aimed at establishing a partial encirclement, which could put additional pressure on Ukrainian defenses and complicate the logistical and operational situation for Ukrainian forces defending Kurakhove and nearby areas. The southern flank toward Kurakhove has seen some Russian progress, particularly after the capture of key villages like Bohoyavlenka, Shakhtarsk, and Novo-Ukrainka. However, the Russian forces have encountered resistance around Yasna, Poliana, Maximivka, and Trudovy. This has slowed their progress. The Russians are pushing toward the Suki-Yali River, having already occupied Konstantinivka and Katarinivka, crossing the river and advancing toward Antonivka. This move poses a direct threat to the Ukrainian defensive line along the river, which could soon be caught in the crossfire. The current outlook for Kurakhove is therefore admittedly bleak, according to Ukrainian media. If, however, the Russians fail to capture the villages along the Suki-Yali River, their plans to encircle and capture Kurakhove could be stalled. The situation in the Pokrovsk direction has seen significant reduction in activity, with the number of battles dropping by 80 to 225 following the capture of Selidove. Despite ongoing Russian efforts to attack across the entire front, from Bozydizemka to Novo-Oleksivka, the territorial gains have been minimal. The Russians have focused their efforts on advancing along the road from Selidove toward Pokrovsk. Managing to gain 1.5 kilometers and nearly capturing Rehorovka. The Russians have also initiated an assault on the village of Petrivka. Additionally, there have been movements westward toward the Dnipro region, with ongoing fighting in Novo-Oleksivka and the outskirts of Yurivka. However, attacks on Lysivka and Promen have ended without much success for the Russians so far. In fact, until the situation in the Kurakhove area is solved, considering that the majority of Russian forces have been diverted there, it is unlikely that the Pokrovsk front will see much momentum. But Ukraine's problems are not limited to Russian cauldrons and Trump's re-election. In the not-too-distant future, Ukraine faces an even more pressing concern that could bring about an even more rapid and destructive end to their ability to defend. On the 4th of November, Medusa reported that Ukraine will face a difficult winter as Russia has destroyed a significant part of its energy sector, which will result in many hours of power outages in the cold months. In quotations, people will die in their homes. To be specific, due to Russian shelling, the Ukrainian energy system has lost half of its generating capacity as of the beginning of this month, according to Politico. Experts predict that governmental measures to conserve electricity may lead to the fact that electricity will not be supplied to households and industrial enterprises in the coming winter for most of the day. Ukraine relies heavily on nuclear energy, which also remains vulnerable to damage from Russian strikes. If that occurs, Alexander Karchenko warns that there is a risk of outages of up to 20 hours per day. In fact, this destructive scenario can be realized if Ukraine's nuclear power plants fail, which will then cause the temperature to fall to below -10 degrees Celsius for a long time. It would not just be the lack of heating and electricity in civilian homes in Ukraine. Victoria Grib, chairman of the Verkhovna Rada subcommittee on energy security, told Politico that this could seriously weaken the electricity needed at defense enterprises and increase the flow of refugees. The situation is really critical, and I hope that international partners will help us as soon as possible, she said. All of the above, and likely more, has led prominent US think tank Foreign Affairs to publish this article, which carried the following statement. Instead of clinging to an infeasible definition of victory, Washington must grapple with the grim reality of the war and come to terms with a more plausible outcome. It should still define victory as Kiev remaining sovereign and independent, but it should jettison the idea that to win, Kiev needs to liberate all its land. So it says, as the United States and its allies continue to arm Ukraine, they must take the uncomfortable step of pushing Kiev to negotiate with the Kremlin and laying out a clear sense of how it should do so. This article, though it seems to be supportive of President Trump's promises to end the war, should not be grasped too easily by the Kremlin, in my opinion. And it is because of this sentence here that Kiev should remain sovereign and independent, and most of all, free to join whatever alliances and associations it wants. This to me is indicative that the West, just like in 2014, isn't ready to relinquish the aim of making Ukraine a part of NATO. Rather, what they're really asking for is a Minsk III, a pause in the hostilities to allow them to rebuild an army in West Ukraine and renew the conflict some years later. The point is, joining NATO is and has been clearly a red line to President Putin, and given the interview at the end of my previous video on the Kurakhove front that I suggest you have a look at, it was not something that either Europe, Russia, or even Ukraine ever wanted. Thus, the idea that Ukraine should be free to join whatever alliances they like is unacceptable to the Kremlin. My concern is, could this article be an indicator of what President Trump's plan for Ukraine really is? If so, the Kremlin will see through it and will likely, and dare I say, ought not to stop until the Ukrainian army is completely defeated and a new pro-Russian regime sits in Kiev.
We have built a foreign policy of hectoring and moralizing and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding poor people, and I think that we should pursue a foreign policy, a diplomacy of respect, and a foreign policy that is not rooted in moralizing. It's rooted in the national interest of this country.